Telecameras 3 and 4 working. Activate radio contact with the outside.
Love, wisdom, abundant life. Live a life filled with meaning, purpose, and a sense of accomplishment.
Can you hear me?
Welcome to the Teachings of Enoch. I'm your host, James Allen. You can contact me, 702-483-7769. That's 702-483-7769. Or online at teachingsofenoch.com. Let's get started with today's message. Welcome to today's show. I'm James Allen, and my guest today is Professor Scott Ray. Scott is also Dean of Faculty and Professor of Christian Ethics at Talbot School of Theology, and he's contributor of Doing the Right Thing, Making Moral Choices in a World Full of Options. Scott proposes that there is such a thing as moral truth, that it can be known, and that it can be put into practice. Scott, thank you for appearing on the show today, and welcome to the show.
Yeah. Thanks, James. Happy to be with you. That's actually a pretty good summary of the book. There is moral truth, it can be known, and it can be done. So well done on the summary there.
Well, Scott, you've done a lot of work in this field. I was looking at your bio, and you've put a lot of work not only into this book, but also to many other things you've written and the work you've done there at Biola for many years. What kind of prompted you to get into this field, talking about ethics and religion and this whole area?
Well, I started out. I did a seminary degree in Old Testament, and I remember I was at a job interview many years ago, and the person interviewing me asked, "How come you started out in Old Testament? How did you make your way into ethics from Old Testament?" And I looked at him like, that's really a serious question? I said, I read the text. I read the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And you can't go very far in the Old Testament, Law and the Prophets, for example, without running just headlong into all sorts of ethical issues. And so it was really an easy transition because I felt like this was an area of application that allowed me to take the biblical text seriously, but also engage the culture seriously. And what I had found was that people who came to ethics out of a Christian worldview didn't engage the culture very well. And, most of the people who were working in ethics, professionally in bioethics and business ethics, most of those folks didn't care one whit about what the Bible taught. And so there was an opportunity, I thought, to bring those two areas that I was very interested in together. And that was probably 25 years ago. And it's been a really nice ride. I tell my dean, my boss, I said, look, if you ever think about firing me, just read the newspaper and you'll be convinced that there's a need for somebody who's doing work in ethics.
Well, there sure is. There sure is, especially when we look at our world today. And your book title hits it right on the head, a world full of options. A lot of choices out there for us to make to go one way or another.
Well, there are. And the interesting thing about the book, we have really had a lot of fun with the book because your listeners may not be aware that the book is based on a film project that was the last really great project that Chuck Colson did before his death a couple years ago. And Chuck had a passion for ethics in the culture, sort of based on the model of the great British reformer William Wilberforce, who was a major crusader not only for the abolition of slavery, but for what he called the reformation of manners in England. And what he meant by that was the reformation of morality in public. And so Chuck had a huge heart for this and commissioned a film series that I got to be a part of. And this is a great series. It's by the same title, Doing the Right Thing. I encourage all your listeners to get access to it. You can get it off the website from the colsoncenter.org, and they make it available at cost for people. It's a terrific film series. Britt Hume from Fox News is the host. It's got a number of really great panelists. I was fortunate to serve on a couple of the 6 episodes. And then I was also involved in the road show that when the film sort of went public, they did major launch events in a number of major cities around the country. I got a chance to know Colson a bit and be around him, and it was so encouraging to get a chance to be part of that. Anyway, he intended to write the book on this. There was always intended to have a book to go along with the film, but he died before it could be done, and the Colson Center asked me to do that. And so it's a companion to the film series, and like any good book, it brings out a lot more than what comes out in the movie, because we got pretty serious limits on space and time in the movie. But the book, I think, adds a lot of stuff. The movie also was not. It was designed to be used in a variety of different settings, not just Christian settings. So they wanted to be used in state university business schools, in companies, something you could show in your neighborhood. And so the film is not, and it's not. It doesn't appeal to the Bible hardly at all. It's not really explicitly Christian, though it's consistent with Christian principles and values. And in the book, all the sort of Christian undercurrents that didn't come out explicitly in the film all come out and are made explicit in the book.
Well, it's good that there's people out there like yourself trying to take a stand and say, look, there is right and wrong, and there is ethics that we need to follow. I took a class in business many years ago, and it was kind of tongue-in-cheek. A proposition was put forth and says, look, if you and your partner have a business, somebody comes in, let's say a senior citizen comes in, and the item is $10, but they accidentally give you $100, not knowing that they gave you the $100, and the person leaves, what should you do? What's the right thing? A, keep the money and not tell your partner, or keep the money and split it with your partner?
There's no C.
Right.
There's no C, which is to return it to the elderly gentleman.
Right. No, there's no C.
That's interesting.
My guest today on the show is Professor Scott Ray. Scott is Dean of Faculty as well as Professor of Christian Ethics at Talbot School of Theology, and he's contributor of Doing the Right Thing, Making Moral Choices in a World Full of Options. I'm James Allen. You're listening to The Teachings of Enoch, and we'll be back right after this.
I've had choices since the day that I was born. There were voices that told me right from wrong. If I had listened, no, I wouldn't be here today, living and dying with the choices I've made. I was tempted by an early age. I found I liked drinking. Oh, and I never turned it down. There were loved ones, but I turned them all away. Now I'm living and dying with the choices I've made. I've had choices since the day that I was born. There were voices that told me right from wrong. If I had listened, no, I wouldn't be here today, living and dying with the choices I made. Guess I'm paying for the things that I've done. If I could go back, oh Lord knows I'd run, but I'm still losing this game life I played, losing and dying with the choices I've made. I've had choices since the day that I was born. There were voices that told me right from wrong. If I had listened, I wouldn't be here today, living and dying with the choices I've made. Living and dying with the choices I've made.
And welcome back to the show. My guest today is Scott Ray. Scott is Dean of Faculty and Professor of Christian Ethics at Talbot School of Theology, and he's contributor of Doing the Right Thing, Making Moral Choices in a World Full of Options. And we're discussing ethics and moral choices. Is there something that's right for everybody, or is really morality something that's good for you, good for me, maybe not good for you, but it's okay for me?
What we found is that there's this discussion of ethics there's a deeper dimension to it that a lot of people don't often realize, and that is we have, in our culture, I think we have lost the distinction between the subjective and the objective. And we put morality and ethics into the realm of what's subjective, which is the realm of personal opinion. It's the realm of personal taste and preference, sort of like your preference for ice cream. But what we want to try to argue in the book is morality is actually something that is objective, and that is it's either true or false, independent of how you feel about it. Whereas something that's subjective is true or false, directly dependent upon how you feel about it. So, for a former student of mine uses this example, and we put this in the book too. The difference between subjective and objective statements. So, for example, if I say that Coke tastes better than Pepsi, it's a subjective statement. Excuse me, sorry about my dog.
No problem. Sounds like you got a friendly dog in the background that wants to join in on us.
Yeah, he does. He's saying, let me get my 2 cents worth in. But so that's a subjective statement. It's just a matter of preference and opinion. But to say an objective statement would be something like that. Diet Coke has fewer calories than regular Coke. It's something that we can verify. We just have to do a simple calorie test. If I said a subjective statement might be something like if I said Hawaii is the most beautiful vacation spot on earth. That's strictly a matter of my subjective opinion. But if I said that an objective fact would be something like George Washington was the first president of the United States, and that can be verified not by science but by history and by the testimony of others who wrote about George Washington. So the kicker comes when we get to a statement like this. If you're going through these objective and subjective statements and you ask this, that abortion, except to save the life of the mother, is wrong. You'd be surprised the mixed view of that we get. Because I think most people in our culture would answer that as a subjective statement. That's simply a matter of opinion or a matter of taste and preference. Much like my preference for sunsets and flavors of ice cream. And it may be that part of the confusion on that is that the culture is divided on it. So I take another one, and I say a statement like this, that racial discrimination is wrong. That one, I think, is a little harder to say that that's just a subjective opinion. And I think what we would say is that somebody who believes that racial discrimination is morally acceptable, that it's okay to discriminate against someone based on the color of their skin, doesn't just have a different perspective. They're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right.
And I think that's what Martin Luther King was so adamant about. I think if you told King that the KKK in the Deep South just had a different opinion or a different perspective on race, he'd say, yeah, they have a different perspective, but their perspective is wrong. That's what he, went to the mat for. And so I think that's the idea that moral truth is something that, is a matter of truth and knowledge. It's not just a matter of opinion. So we would say, my colleague Bill Craig puts it like this. He says, somebody who thinks that sexual assault is morally acceptable doesn't need an argument. They need therapy. Because it's so obvious that sexual assault is morally wrong, and anybody who disagrees with that, we would say is sick. It's not that they have a different maybe valid perspective for them. No, we would say they're just wrong. They're just flat wrong about that. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's part of the point we're making, that morality is in the category of the objective, not the subjective.
Well, my guest today on the show is Professor Scott Ray. Scott is Dean of Faculty as well as Professor of Christian Ethics at Talbot School of Theology, and he's contributor of Doing the Right Thing, Making Moral Choices in a World Full of Options. I'm James Allen. You're listening to The Teachings of Enoch, and we'll be back right after this.
Tell me about the good old days. Sometimes it feels like this world's gone crazy. Grandpa, take me back to yesterday, when the line between right and wrong didn't seem so hazy. Did lovers really fall in love to stay, stand beside each other, come what may? Is a promise really something people kept, not just something they would say? Families really bow their heads to pray, daddies really never go away. Oh, Grandpa, tell me about the good old days. Everything is changing fast. We call it progress, but I just don't know. And Grandpa, let's wander back into the past, then paint me the picture of long ago. Lovers really fall in love to stay, stand beside each other, come what may. Is a promise really something people kept, not just something they would say and then forget? Families really bow their heads to pray, daddies really never go away. Oh, Grandpa, tell me about the good old days. Oh, Grandpa, tell me about the good old days.
And welcome back to the show. My guest today is Scott Ray. Scott is Dean of Faculty and Professor of Christian Ethics at Talbot School of Theology, and he's contributor of Doing the Right Thing, Making Moral Choices in a World Full of Options. And we're discussing ethics and moral choices. Is there something that's right for everybody, or is really morality something that's good for you, good for me, maybe not good for you, but it's okay for me? Where do we find our morality? I mean, there seems to be so many different ways that we're pulled in our culture. This is okay, that's okay. The TV, the media tells us this as a general rule is okay. If you disagree with that, well, we're going to shut you down. But in reality, Scott, where do we find the basis for what is actually right and wrong?
Yeah, I think from a distinctly Christian worldview, of course, morality is rooted in the character of God, that we have the moral demands and obligations that we do because God's the kind of God that He is. For example, we're called to love our neighbor as ourselves, not primarily because love makes the world go round, though I think there's probably some truth to that. But it's because God is that kind of a God, is a loving God. We're called to be forgiving because God's fundamentally a forgiving God. And that expresses itself, God's character expresses itself in the various commands and principles of Scripture. And then what we argue in the book is that through an approach known as natural law, one of the ways in which God communicates morality is inside the pages of Scripture, but God also communicates morality outside the pages of Scripture through experience, through nature, a variety of other, through reason, a variety of other things. And it's fine. I think we agree that there are lots of things we disagree on. But I think if you look, there's a remarkable moral consensus on a variety of things that transcend time and culture, and we tend to major on the moral diversity that there is, but I think we lose track sometimes of the fairly deep reservoir of shared values that we do have. For example, there are a whole host of things that are wrong and have always been considered wrong in most cultures around the world. Murder. Adultery's been considered wrong. You may have multiple wives, but you can't have somebody else's wife. Sexual assault, a whole wide variety of things. So I think there's evidence in the consensus about morality in the world, about some of those core things that we would say they're just plain wrong. And again, if you try to justify yourself, we would say you probably are more in need of a therapist than a philosopher.
Yeah. Well, like you said, when we look at nature, and even when we look at some of the animal life, the way they take care of each other for the most part, I mean, they're nurturing, and I'm sure there's some small groups of animals that you're out on your own, but most of the time there's some nurturing, there's some caring, at least until the smaller animals are able to care for themselves. And I think we can learn from that in our, like you said, Scott, our own culture and our own lives, that there is something that we have to agree on. Otherwise, we're not going to exist as a civilized society.
Take for example the norm of truth-telling. If that were not a basically accepted norm throughout the culture, it wouldn't be long before anything resembling meaningful communication would cease to exist. Because if I am all of the time wondering if I can trust what you're saying to me, it's not long before we're going to lose the ability to even communicate at all. And I think you can make a fairly good case that even in parts of the world, even in the developing world, that a flourishing economy is premised on trust and openness and fairness. You hear a lot of talk about ethics and in the workplace and in business and how greed and all these things are running rampant. What we forget is that there's a fairly fairly high level, fairly high modicum of virtue that's required and nurtured by participation in the market economy. Virtues of service. I mean, imagine how far a company would get if they did not embody the virtue of service. The virtues of initiative and creativity and innovation and thrift and hard work, all of those things. But trust seems to be it's the glue that holds it together. And I mean, imagine what it's like doing business in cultures where the trust level is low. It's not an accident that the countries that are at the top of the corruption index are at the bottom of the GDP index. And I had a student a few years ago who had come to the U.S. to study from Ethiopia, and he had never. I took him out to lunch the second or so day he was on, in L.A. area, and he had never seen a credit transaction before, and I took out my credit card to pay for our lunch, and he said, "What's that?" He'd never seen a credit card before. And I hate to think what was going through his mind as I signed the bill and we